My brother didn't know I was watching from the hallway when he slipped something into my coffee. He didn't know I had spent the last 3 weeks quietly documenting every lie, every forged signature, and every hushed phone call. He didn't know that the woman he had spent 30 years treating like a piece of furniture had finally decided to stop being convenient. He needed me gone before the estate lawyer read the will on Friday morning, and he had exactly 48 hours to make that happen. I didn't scream. I didn't grab the mug and throw it at the wall. I just stood there in the doorway of my mother's kitchen, watching my brother stir my coffee with a satisfied little smile. And I thought about the bottle of prescription blood thinners I had seen him pocket from my mother's medicine cabinet 2 days ago, the ones that had gone missing right after her doctor's appointment, the ones her chart said should never be mixed with caffeine in large doses. I picked up the mug. I looked at it. Then I looked at my sister-in-law, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone and her perfect manicure and her mouth pressed into a thin, greedy line. She had flown in from Calgary the moment she heard my mother was in palliative care, not to say goodbye, to count rooms. Before I tell you what happened next, and what I was hiding in the pocket of my cardigan the entire time, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me the one moment you realized someone you loved had never actually loved you back. I want to read every single one. I should explain how I became the invisible one. Every family has a structure, and ours was decided before I was old enough to have a say in it. My brother, Daniel, was the eldest. He was loud and charming, and he took up space in every room he entered. He was the one who got the car at 16 and the tuition paid in full, and the benefit of every doubt my parents ever had to offer. I was 4 years younger, and I was quiet. And somewhere along the way, quiet got confused with capable, and capable got confused with available, and available became the only thing I was allowed to be. I was the one who drove my mother to her chemotherapy appointments, while Daniel sent flowers from Vancouver. I was the one who coordinated with the home care nurses and filled out the insurance forms, and learned, through sheer necessity, exactly what a living will does and does not cover under Ontario law. I was the one who slept on a cot in the spare room for 3 months, because my mother was afraid at night and wouldn't say so out loud. I did all of this without being asked, which was exactly the problem. Because in our family, doing something without being asked meant you had volunteered. And once you volunteered, it became your permanent assignment. I didn't resent the work. I resented what the work was worth to them, which was nothing. My mother's name was Patricia. She had been sick for 2 years. She had a semi-detached house in Hamilton that she had owned outright since my father died, a modest RRSP, and a life insurance policy that my father had taken out in 1987 and never canceled. The total value of her estate, once the house sold, was somewhere north of $600,000. Not a fortune, not nothing. She had told me privately, the previous spring, that she was dividing the estate evenly, half to Daniel, half to me, minus a small amount set aside for her sister in Sudbury. She had also told me, very specifically, that the house was not to be sold until she had been gone for at least a year. She wanted the garden to go through one more summer without anyone deciding what to do with it. She had told me this while I was making her tea. She had told me this with the particular gravity of someone who understands they are running out of chances to say things out loud. I believed her. I also made sure quietly to get it in writing. What I didn't know was that Daniel had gotten there first. It started 2 months before she died. I noticed that my mother seemed confused after Daniel's visits in a way she wasn't otherwise. Not the ordinary confusion that came with her illness and her medications, but a specific kind of blankness, like a page that had been carefully erased. She would repeat conversations we'd already had. She would refer to decisions she had apparently made that I had no knowledge of. Once, she mentioned that Daniel had explained the best thing to do with the house would be to sell it quickly and split the proceeds before the estate got complicated. I asked her who had told her that. She looked at me like I had just appeared out of nowhere. Daniel had been visiting more often in those last months. I had assumed it was because he felt guilty. I was wrong. He had been bringing his wife, Sasha. Sasha, who had a business administration background and a very specific understanding of how POA documents worked if you got someone to sign them at the right moment. Sasha, who had been having long, careful conversations with my mother's lawyer, a man she had known since before I was born, asking friendly preliminary questions about probate timelines and estate disbursement. I found the amended document by accident. I was looking for my mother's provincial health card in the filing cabinet in her bedroom, which was where she kept everything important, and I found a folder I didn't recognize. Inside was a new version of her will. It had been prepared 4 weeks earlier. The distribution had changed. Daniel was now receiving 70%. I was receiving 30%. The clause about the garden and the 1-year wait before selling the house had been removed entirely. The signature at the bottom was my mother's, but the handwriting looked careful in the wrong way, labored, like someone had guided her hand. I stood in that bedroom for a long time. I put the folder back exactly where I found it. I went downstairs and I made dinner and I said nothing at all. I am not a dramatic person. I grew up learning that if you showed your cards too early in our family, someone would find a way to use them against you. I had watched Daniel do it my entire life. The moment you got emotional, the moment you raised your voice or cried or made clear that something mattered to you, you lost. Because he would take that thing, whatever it was, and he would hold it just out of reach until you agreed to something you didn't want to agree to. So I waited. And I started paying attention in a different way. I am not a tech person, but I am a practical person, and the internet is a remarkably patient teacher. I ordered a small digital audio recorder from an online retailer. It was about the size of a USB drive, and it looked exactly like one. I set it on my mother's bookshelf the following Tuesday, tucked between the spine of a Maeve Binchy novel and a ceramic owl that had lived there since the 90s. I told my mother I was backing up her old photos. I set it to record in segments of 6 hours, and I changed the files every morning when I came by. I didn't have to wait long. The third recording was the one that changed everything. Daniel and Sasha had come for dinner on a Thursday. I wasn't there. I had been, very specifically, not invited. I played the recording in my car parked outside of Tim Hortons, and I listened to the whole thing with my hands folded in my lap. The first part was ordinary enough. Conversation about the weather, about Sasha's sister's new baby, about the traffic on the 403. Then my mother went to bed early, which she had been doing more often, and I heard the shift in the room. The sound of Daniel's voice dropping in a way that meant he thought no one was listening. He was on the phone. I heard him pacing, the floor creaking, the way it always did near the window. The voice on the other end belonged to the lawyer, the one my mother had known since before I was born. They were discussing the timeline. They were discussing what would happen if the estate was contested, and how best to position the amended will so that any challenge would be costly and time-consuming enough that I would likely give up. They discussed the house listing. They had already contacted a real estate agent. They discussed the fact that it would be cleaner, simpler, faster if I were not around for the final weeks. If I were managed out of the situation before the death certificate was signed, the lawyer said something I still think about, in a flat, procedural voice, like he was discussing a zoning variance. He said that given the circumstances, the most efficient outcome would be one where the secondary beneficiary was not in a position to raise questions. Daniel said he understood. Sasha said nothing, but I heard the specific silence of someone who has already agreed to something and is waiting for it to be done. I sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes. Then I drove to a legal clinic on King Street and made an appointment for the following Monday. The lawyer at the clinic was a woman about 10 years older than me, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a very specific kind of calm that comes from having heard things that cannot be unheard. I showed her the recording. I showed her the original will, which I had photographed in full the afternoon I found it. I showed her the text messages from my mother's phone, which I had copied with her knowledge and her consent during one of our afternoons together when she was lucid and tired and wanted me to understand what had been happening to her. My mother had known, in her way. She had been frightened and confused, and she had not known who to trust. But she had trusted me, and on a Tuesday in November, when the light was coming through the kitchen window in that particular late autumn way, and she was having a good morning, she had looked at me and said, "Whatever happens, you know what I actually wanted." I said I knew. She said she was sorry she hadn't been stronger. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I meant it. The legal clinic lawyer explained my options carefully and without drama. An estate challenge was possible and had reasonable grounds. A complaint to the Law Society regarding the lawyer was also possible. The recording, depending on how it had been obtained, was admissible under Ontario's one-party consent laws. She walked me through what that meant. She told me what to hold on to, and what to document further, and what not to do. I went home. I kept coming by every morning. I said nothing to Daniel. My mother died on a Sunday in December, early in the morning, with me sitting in the chair beside her bed. She had asked for the window to be left open a crack the night before. The cold came in and she said it smelled like the yard when she was a girl. I held her hand until it was over. I called Daniel an hour later. He arrived with Sasha and a list. The week after my mother's funeral was the week I understood what I was dealing with. Daniel moved efficiently and without sentiment. He called the real estate agent before the obituary had finished running. He began removing items from the house, furniture and jewelry and the good dishes, citing a need to, quote, prevent deterioration of the estate. He told me he would handle the paperwork. He told me there was no need for me to hire a lawyer since it would just add cost to the estate that would come out of both our shares. He said this in a reasonable voice, standing in my mother's kitchen, and I nodded and said I appreciated the thought. I had already retained a lawyer 2 weeks prior. The afternoon it came to a head, the four of us were gathered in that kitchen again. Daniel, Sasha, myself, and a woman named Rita, who was my mother's oldest friend and had been named as a witness in the original will. Rita was 73 and walked with a cane and had driven herself from Ancaster and was not in the mood for any of it. Daniel had arranged the meeting. He had framed it as a chance to align on next steps before the estate lawyer read the will. What he had actually arranged, I understand now, was an opportunity to present a unified front to me before I had access to formal legal process. The amended will was sitting on the table in front of him in a manila folder. He was going to show it to me as though I had never seen it. He was going to explain the changes in a tone that suggested they were routine. He poured coffee for everyone. He set mine in front of me. He didn't know I had already done a full inventory of my mother's medicine cabinet 2 days earlier, after I noticed that the prescription bottle her palliative care doctor had called in before she died was missing from the shelf. Her warfarin. The one she'd been off of for months because of a procedure, but that the doctor had called in anyway as a precaution for the following weeks, and which I had picked up myself, and which I was certain I had placed on the second shelf beside her evening medications. The bottle was gone. I looked at Daniel while he poured. I looked at Sasha's hands on the table, very still. I looked at my coffee mug and I thought about the warfarin, and I thought about the fact that Daniel had been in the house the day before, alone, with a key I had given him in good faith. I thought about the recording. I thought about the lawyer's voice saying the most efficient outcome would be one where the secondary beneficiary was not in a position to raise questions. I did not touch the coffee. Before I tell you what I did next, I want you to understand something. I am not someone who makes impulsive decisions. I grew up watching what happened to people in my family who moved without thinking. The grief does not help. The exhaustion does not help. Everything in my body wanted to tip that mug over and walk out the door and never come back. But I had worked too carefully and too long to blow it over a coffee I wasn't sure about. What I did instead was reach into the pocket of my cardigan. I had brought my phone, and on my phone was the audio clip from the recorder. And before I played it, I set the phone face down on the table very gently, in the center of the four of us, and I said, I think we should talk about the original will before we go any further. Daniel's expression didn't change much, but Sasha's did. Just slightly. A tightening at the corners of her eyes. He went through the motions. He opened the folder. He began explaining the amendments in his reasonable voice. He said our mother had wanted to acknowledge the differences in our situations, his family, his children, the expenses of the move from Vancouver. He said she had expressed this clearly and voluntarily, and the lawyer had simply formalized what she'd wanted. Rita, who had been quiet until then, set down her cane with a very specific sound. She said, "That's not what she told me." The room shifted. Daniel looked at Rita in the way he had always looked at obstacles. Calculating distance, he said, "With respect, Patricia wasn't always consistent in those last months." Rita said, "She was consistent with me. She told me exactly what she wanted, and it was not this." I reached over and I turned my phone face up and I pressed play. I had cued it to the section I needed. Daniel's voice, low and pacing, the floor creaking near the window. The lawyer's voice, flat and procedural. The specific sentence about the secondary beneficiary. Sasha's silence, recognizable even on a recording. I let it play for 90 seconds. Then I stopped it and I looked at my brother. His face had gone a very particular color. Not angry, something past angry. The face of someone who has just realized the room they thought they controlled has a door they didn't know about. Sasha pushed back her chair slightly. Instinct. I said, "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I have the original will documented, the one with Mother's actual signature and Rita as witness. I have this recording, which is legal under Ontario law. I have photographs of the amended document and a timeline of when it was prepared relative to Mother's cognitive state in those weeks, which her palliative care notes corroborate in detail." I paused. I also want to know where her warfarin is. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. Sasha stood up and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door open, and then her voice outside, low and fast, on the phone. Daniel looked at the table. Rita looked at Daniel with the specific expression of a woman who has watched an entire lifetime of people making the wrong choices and has simply run out of patience for it. I said, "I'm not doing this for money. I want to be clear about that. I'm doing this because she told me what she wanted on a Tuesday morning in November, and she deserved to have someone fight for it." Daniel said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The performance had gone out of it. What was left was just tired. He said, "You were always going to do this." I said, "Someone had to." I did not touch the coffee. I never found out for certain what was in it, And in the end, that uncertainty was part of what made it easier to let the lawyers handle everything from that point forward. I reported the missing medication to her palliative care doctor. I filed a formal complaint with the Law Society regarding the lawyer's conduct. I retained the estate lawyer who had drafted the original will, a different one from the man Daniel had been calling, and I initiated a challenge to the amended document on the grounds of undue influence and capacity. It took 7 months. Estate litigation always takes longer than you expect, and it costs more than you budget for, and there are moments in the middle of it where you genuinely cannot tell if any of it is worth the wait. But I had my mother's voice in writing. I had Rita. I had 90 seconds of audio from a Thursday evening in December that turned out to be worth more than any amount Daniel had counted on inheriting. The court set aside the amended will. The estate was distributed according to the original terms. My mother's sister in Sudbury received her portion. The house sold the following September, which meant the garden went through one more summer. I drove up in July and walked through it and stood there for a while, and didn't try to feel any particular way about it. The real estate agent had called it a lovely family home. She was not wrong. Daniel and I have not spoken since the judgment. I don't know if we will. Some bridges you don't burn so much as watch burn, and then you realize the only thing that was ever on the other side was a longer version of the same story. Sasha never came back to that kitchen after she walked out. I think she understood before Daniel did what the recording meant. Rita came to the house sale closing with a card she had written by hand. Inside, she had copied out a line from something my mother had apparently said to her in the last weeks. It said, "The quiet ones are always keeping count. I keep the card in the drawer of my desk. I take it out sometimes when I need to remember that patience is not the same as weakness, that watching is not the same as doing nothing, that the most dangerous thing you can be, in a family that has decided you are furniture, is someone who has been paying close attention all along." I changed the locks before I listed the house. I packed my mother's ceramic owl and her Maeve Binchy novels and the recorder that had been sitting between them, and I put them in a box marked things to keep. The recorder I kept as a reminder, the owl, because my mother loved it, the books because she had held them, and sometimes that is enough. So tell me, if you had been sitting at that table, watching the coffee, knowing what I knew, what would you have done? Would you have played the recording right then? Or would you have waited and let him believe, for just a little longer, that he had already won? Drop your answer below. And if you've ever had to fight for what someone you loved actually wanted, share this. Someone out there needs to know that the quiet ones don't always stay quiet.